Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in Montgomery, Alabama's history. A photo was taken on the Freeman Plantation, which is near Montgomery, Alabama, in 1861. It looked like just another formal picture of the antebellum South, showing off property and wealth to the average person. The picture showed a big white house with columns and a few well-dressed people. In the corner, where it was hard to see, there was a man named Isaac in the photographer's notes. This picture was part of a collection of Civil War-era photos for almost 100 years. It was just one of thousands that showed the time before America tore itself apart. No one noticed what Isaac had to hold in his hands until archivist Margaret Hamilton looked at the picture in 1963. The discovery would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations into the psychological horrors of plantation life ever documented, revealing a pattern of psychological torture that extended far beyond physical brutality. But by the time the truth came out, almost everyone involved in the case had already died, leaving behind only bits of evidence and rumors. County records from 1860 show that the plantation belonged to Thomas Wilson. Local newspapers called him a gentleman of means and a powerful man in Montgomery society. The records show that Wilson bought the land in 1852 after moving from Virginia. He brought 17 slaves with him, one of whom was named Isaac Freeman. The Freeman name only shows up in records after emancipation, but the Wilson plantation grew cotton and was considered to be doing well for the time. Records found later show that what made it unusual was that there were very few reported escape attempts compared to nearby properties at the time. People said that Wilson treated the people he enslaved humanely, which is why this happened. Local church records even say that the Baptist Church praised Wilson for how well he ran his household as a Christian. This idea would later turn out to be very wrong. The picture in question was taken in April 1861, just after Alabama left the Union and tensions were rising toward what would become the Civil War. The Alabama Historical Society has a logbook from the photographer that says Wilson hired him to take the pictures to celebrate his daughter Ella Linena's engagement to James Caldwell, the son of another well-known local family. Frederick Sullivan, the photographer, said that he charged Wilson $25 for a set of portraits that included pictures of the house, the family, and what he called property inventory images. Sullivan kept the last set of pictures in his private collection until he died in 1920. His estate gave the pictures to the Alabama Historical Society, where they were cataloged but mostly ignored for decades. It wasn't until 1963, when Margaret Hamilton was getting ready for a Civil War centennial exhibit, that she noticed something strange about one of the pictures. Hamilton wrote in her notes, "Upon closer examination of photograph labeled Wilson Plantation, April 1861, I observed that the enslaved man standing at the edge of the frame appears to be holding something unusual in his hands. Initial inspection suggested it might be farm implements, but magnification reveals what appears to be human remains, possibly preserved fingers. I have contacted Professor William Jenkins at the university for further analysis." This brief note would spark an investigation that revealed a system of psychological control so disturbing that several researchers reportedly abandoned the project. Professor Jenkins, an anthropologist who studies the cultural history of the Deep South, and his graduate assistant, Thomas Marks, looked into the case. Their findings, which were put together in a 60-page report and filed in the university archives in 1965, showed that there was planned psychological terror hidden behind a facade of Southern gentility. Jenkins' report says that Isaac Freeman was holding human remains in the picture, specifically preserved human fingers in a small glass jar. But whose fingers they were and why Freeman had to hold them needed more research. Jenkins and Mark spent almost 2 years putting the story together. They talked to older people in Montgomery who had heard stories passed down through the years, looked at county records, and read personal letters that had been kept in different family collections. The most important find was a journal belonging to Ella Linena Wilson, Thomas Wilson's daughter. It was found in the attic of her granddaughter's house in Birmingham. The journal, which covers the years 1860 to 1863, has a lot of disturbing entries about life on the plantation and how her father kept things in order. On the 12th of January, 1861, an entry said, "Father told Mr. Caldwell about his ideas on how to manage the property. James seemed impressed but a little upset by Father's demonstration with Isaac. Father said it was necessary to keep order without using common brutality. He said the mind is easier to control than the body and has a longer-lasting effect. I admit I left the room when he brought out the jar. More research showed that Thomas Wilson had come up with what he thought was a smart way to stop people from trying to escape and resist him. Wilson didn't just use physical punishment, which he thought was ineffective, and hurt the value of his property. Instead, he made a psychological system of control based on what Jenkins called ritualized terror. County medical records showed that Wilson had briefly studied medicine at the University of Virginia before leaving the field to run his family's plantation business. Even though this training was very basic, it seems to have shaped how he controlled the people he enslaved. Wilson didn't whip people in public. Instead, he used medical procedures and psychological manipulation to keep people scared all the time. After the Civil War, former slaves from nearby plantations gave depositions that said Wilson had a reputation for being different in how he did things. Freedmen's Bureau agents wrote down a story from a man named Samuel Johnson in 1867. He said, "Mr. Wilson didn't whip much, not like the others, but everybody was more scared of him than any other master around. He'd take people to that room in the back of the big house and they'd come out different, sometimes with parts missing. He'd make the others carry those parts around, keep them close, like a warning." It seems that the room that came up in several accounts was a modified study in the back of the Wilson plantation house. Thomas Wilson turned it into what he called his management office. Ella Lenena's journal says that the room had medical tools, diagrams of the body, and a few preserved specimens in glass jars. Wilson would do what he called corrections on people who showed signs of resistance or independent thought here. The most upsetting part of Wilson's system, and what the 1,861 photo seems to show, was that he made people carry preserved remains of family members or close friends who had tried to escape or broken other serious plantation rules. Jenkins and Marks found out that the fingers probably belonged to Isaac Freeman's brother, Jacob, who tried to escape in 1859 and died while being caught. They did this by comparing plantation records with church burial records. Ella Lenena Wilson wrote in her journal on the 3rd of November, 1859, that Father had Isaac present during the procedure with Jacob. She said that it was important for family to see the lesson. Isaac will now be in charge of carrying the reminder, which Father thinks will make him follow the rules better than any overseer could. Making someone carry preserved remains of a loved one as a constant reminder of what happens when they don't obey is a very cruel form of psychological torture. Wilson's method was even more dangerous because he said it was more humane than other ways of punishing people physically. Wilson wrote to other plantation owners, some of which are still in the Caldwell family papers, to say that his methods were both more effective and more in line with Christian ideas of stewardship. In a letter dated the 18th of July, 1860, Wilson wrote to James Caldwell's father, "The modern plantation owner must recognize that maintenance of order through mere physical correction is both inefficient and increasingly looked upon with disfavor by certain elements in society. My methods preserve the value of property while ensuring compliance through engagement of the mind rather than destruction of the body. I have not lost a single hand to escape in 3 years, nor suffered any of the productivity losses associated with excessive physical correction." It seems that Wilson took the picture of Isaac Freeman holding the jar with his brother's preserved fingers to show his future son-in-law how he did things. Ella Lenena's journal says that James Caldwell was being prepared to take over the management of the Wilson Caldwell properties after he married Ella Lenena. It looks like the photo session in April 1861 was partly set up to show Caldwell how Wilson ran his plantation. What happened to Isaac Freeman after the picture was taken? The historical record starts to fall apart here. Plantation records show that he lived on the Wilson property until at least 1863. A note in the property ledger from February of that year says he was given special duty in the main house. After that, the Wilson papers don't mention him again. Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866 show that a man named Isaac Freeman registered in Montgomery to get food. This is the next time Isaac Freeman is mentioned. The registration says that he was about 40 years old and had visible mutilation of the left hand, 3 fingers missing. It's not clear if this mutilation had anything to do with Wilson's management style. but the timing and nature of the injury suggest that it might have. Marks collected oral histories from descendants of people who had been enslaved in the Montgomery area. These stories about the Wilson plantation and a man who had to carry death in his hands lasted well into the 20th century. In 1964, Martha Johnson, who was 87 at the time, told a story about what her grandmother had told her about Isaac Freeman. Grandma Mahar said that a man carried his brother's fingers in a jar with him everywhere he went. Massa made him show it to everyone as a warning. After that, the man never spoke above a whisper and would hide his hands whenever anyone looked at him. He carried those fingers until freedom came, then buried them under a tree and left Montgomery. He never came back. After the Civil War, the Wilson plantation itself fell into disrepair. County records say that Thomas Wilson died of typhoid fever in 1864 while he was a medical officer in the Confederate Army. His daughter L.A. Lanena and her husband James Caldwell tried to keep the property after the war, but they had to sell most of it by 1870 because they didn't have enough money. The main house burned down in 1873, and people said it was because of a fire in the kitchen that wasn't put out. However, some people thought it was arson. What makes this case especially disturbing is not only the psychological torture that Isaac Freeman and others went through, but also how the person who did it justified it and even called it progressive. It seems that Thomas Wilson really thought that his methods were more humane than regular physical punishment, and people in his social circle agreed with him. This twisted reasoning, which says that advanced psychological torture is better than physical violence, shows how systems of oppression can be kept in place and defended, even by people who think they are enlightened. The university got Professor Jenkins' report on the case in 1965, but it was never made public. His personal letters, which were found among his papers after he died in 1978, show that he thought the material was too disturbing and could cause trauma if it were made public. Thomas Marks, his research assistant, didn't agree with this choice. He said that the story needed to be told as part of a full account of the horrors of plantation life. This disagreement caused a permanent split between the two scholars. In 1967, Marks tried to publish an article about the Wilson plantation and a picture of Isaac Freeman in an academic journal, but it was turned down because the evidence was too weak and the claims were too shocking. Marks was reportedly frustrated by this rejection and continued his research on his own until he died in a car accident in 1969. There was never any sign of his research notes, which were said to have more evidence than what was in Jenkins' original report. The picture stayed in the Alabama Historical Society archives until 1968, when the last Wilson Caldwell descendants asked that it be taken down from public view. The family said they would sue if the photo and the research that went with it stayed available, saying that Jenkins and Marks's conclusions were false and based on misinterpreted evidence. The society did what was asked because it didn't have the money to fight a possible lawsuit. The case stayed mostly hidden for decades, known only to a few historians who study psychological control methods used on plantations. It is said that the photograph was sent to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. in 1972 as part of a larger collection of Civil War-era images. There, it was cataloged, without the controversial analysis of its contents. While working on her PhD dissertation about psychological control mechanisms on antebellum plantations in 1988, historian Rebecca Collins came across mentions of the photograph and Jenkins' research. She was mostly unsuccessful in her efforts to find the original photograph and research materials because the Wilson Caldwell family had already gotten a court order to seal many of the relevant documents. Collins' dissertation only briefly talked about the case. It said, "Substantial evidence suggests some plantation owners developed sophisticated psychological torture methods involving preserved human remains as control mechanisms, though specific documentation remains inaccessible due to ongoing legal restrictions." We only know a little about Isaac Freeman's life after he was freed from slavery because of scattered records and oral histories. The Freedmen's Bureau said that he worked as a laborer in Montgomery for a short time until about 1868, when he stopped appearing in official records. Martha Johnson's oral history says that local stories said Freeman left Alabama for good, maybe heading north. One story said he eventually moved to Illinois, while another said he joined a group of people who had been slaves in Kansas. There is no way to be sure that any of these stories are true. The last time someone might have seen Isaac Freeman was in the Journal of a Methodist Minister in Cairo, Illinois, from 1873. The entry talks about meeting a strange man who was missing a few fingers and always had a small wooden box with him. When people asked him about his past, he would only say that he was from Alabama and that some burdens cannot be put down, only buried. It is not clear if this is the same Isaac Freeman who worked on the Wilson plantation. Carrying preserved remains of a family member as a way to control them has a very harmful effect on the mind. Modern psychological analysis indicates that such practices would likely induce significant trauma, potentially leading to conditions akin to what is currently identified as post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant physical reminder of a loved one's death, along with the need to show that reminder to others as a warning, would make a complex psychological prison that might be more effective than physical restraints. Thomas Wilson's system seems to have been unique in its details, but it was part of a larger set of psychological control methods used in the plantation South. Wilson's method stood out because it was based on a pseudo-scientific framework, and he openly rejected physical punishment in favor of what he thought were more advanced methods. This enabled him to preserve an image of sophistication and humanity while causing significant psychological harm. The attempts to hide the story of Isaac Freeman and the Wilson plantation practices make us think about historical memory and responsibility. The Wilson-Caldwell descendants' successful campaign to limit access to the photograph and related research exemplifies a recurring trend of historical erasure that frequently accompanies efforts to confront the most egregious elements of American slavery. Families and institutions with ties to plantation-era atrocities have often been able to keep disturbing histories from the public eye by controlling access to evidence and questioning the credibility of researchers. The picture of Isaac Freeman holding the jar with his brother's preserved fingers is still a haunting record of psychological torture that was passed off as smart management. The fact that it was made on purpose to show how Wilson worked and to teach his future son-in-law makes the picture even more terrifying. It shows not just one person's pain, but the planned system that caused that pain and the social setting that accepted it. In 1960, archaeologists did a survey of the old Wilson plantation land before it was turned into businesses. They found a small glass jar buried about 3 feet deep in what would have been the northeast corner of the main house. 3 preserved human fingers were inside the jar. Even though years of moisture on the ground had ruined the preservation fluid, DNA testing was not done because the technology was not yet available. The remains were then buried again without much documentation. We can't be sure if these are the same remains that can be seen in the 1861 photo, but the find's location and nature suggest that they might be related. The tale of Isaac Freeman and the Wilson plantation exemplifies a scenario where photographic evidence documented a moment of psychological horror that may have otherwise gone unrecorded. The picture looks normal at first, but when you see what Isaac is holding, it reminds me of how the Wilson plantation's reputation for treating people well hid the fact that they were really good at psychological torture. It reminds us that terrible things in history often happened right in front of our eyes, but we didn't see them because of social norms and intentional lies. The land where the Wilson plantation used to be is now a commercial area on the outskirts of Montgomery. There are no historical markers on the property that talk about its past or the pain that happened there. Reports say that the descendants of Thomas Wilson and James Caldwell still have a lot of power in Alabama politics and business, even though they have distanced themselves from the plantation work of their ancestors. The location of the photograph itself is still unknown. Some sources say that a government official with ties to the Wilson-Caldwell family asked for it to be permanently taken out of the National Archives in 1992. Some people say it is still in the archives but has been put in a new category that makes it hard to find. More recent historians have tried to get to the image, but they have been unsuccessful, often because of bureaucratic problems or claims that the picture cannot be found. Isaac Freeman's story, in which he was forced to carry his brother's preserved remains as a way to control him psychologically, is an example of the complicated and often overlooked ways that people were controlled during American slavery. There were also systems of psychological manipulation that were meant to break resistance not by hurting the body, but by hurting the mind. The fact that the people who did such advanced forms of psychological torture could call them progressive improvements shows how deeply immoral people were in allowing slavery to continue. We only have written accounts, incomplete historical records, and oral histories that have been passed down through the years because we don't have the original picture. The picture of a man holding a jar with his brother's preserved fingers, which was taken for posterity and then systematically hidden, has become a symbol of the larger historical erasure of the psychological effects of slavery. These histories, like the picture, are on the edges and can only be seen when we look closely enough to see what has always been there. An older person from Montgomery told Thomas Marks in 1964, "Some things get buried, but nothing really goes away. The past is always right there, under our feet, waiting for someone to dig it up again." The most disturbing thing about the Wilson plantation case is how it shows how systems of oppression change and adapt, coming up with new ways to control people when old ones stop working. Thomas Wilson's transition from corporeal punishment to psychological torment precedes contemporary modalities of control that function through the psyche rather than the physique. His assertion that his methods were more humane resonates with contemporary rationalizations for advanced systems of control that leave no discernible traces. The picture of Isaac Freeman, who is standing stiffly at the edge of the frame and holding his brother's body, shows a moment of historical horror that goes far beyond the picture itself. It reminds us that sometimes the most important parts of history are not in the center of the frame, but in the margins, where uncomfortable truths often hide. According to archivist Margaret Hamilton, who was the first to notice the disturbing detail in the photo, history reveals itself in the periphery, in the things we are not meant to notice. Once seen, they cannot be unseen, and they change everything we thought we knew about the picture as a whole. The jar with human fingers may have been buried, the photo may have been hidden, and the documents may have been sealed, but the story they tell about the psychological aspects of slavery is still an important part of American history, a history that continues to shape our present in ways that are both acknowledged and denied. We all carry the burden of this history, just like Isaac Freeman, whether we want to or not. A woman named Sarah Thompson contacted the Alabama Historical Society in 1957, almost 10 years before Jenkins and Marks started their investigation. She said she was a descendant of Isaac Freeman. Thompson asked the society for access to any records related to the Wilson plantation, saying that family stories had been passed down about an ancestor who had been subjected to unusual cruelty involving preserved remains. The society's director apparently turned down her request, saying in internal correspondence that dealing with such requests would only inflame tensions at a time when our state is dealing with enough controversy. Thompson was not easily discouraged. The Montgomery County Courthouse has records that show she formally asked for access to property records related to the Wilson plantation in 1958. This request was granted, but the records didn't have much information other than basic property transactions. More importantly, she put an ad in the Montgomery Advertiser asking anyone with family ties to the Wilson plantation to get in touch with her. The ad ran for 3 Sundays in a row, according to newspaper archives, but no one responded. Thompson didn't know that her questions had gotten people's attention. On the 10th of June 1958, James Wilson Caldwell III, a well-known businessman in Montgomery and a direct descendant of Thomas Wilson, wrote to the director of the Historical Society. He was worried about a colored woman asking questions about family matters best left in the past. The letter said that appropriate measures be taken to discourage further investigation. Thompson's efforts to learn about her family history happened at the same time as the early years of the civil rights movement in Montgomery. The Montgomery bus boycott had brought national attention to racial injustice in the city just 2 years before this. In this tense time, some white people were especially against efforts to look into the terrible things that happened on plantations. Civil rights archives at Alabama State University say that several African American researchers who were trying to document the histories of plantations during this time reported being harassed and threatened. It's not clear what happened to Sarah Thompson after 1958. After that year, her name is no longer listed in public records in Montgomery. In a 1977 oral history interview with civil rights activist Robert Williams, he said that a woman who was thought to be Thompson moved to Detroit after getting threats that were not signed. Williams said, "There was a woman who wanted to know about plantation records. She said something about her great-grandfather having to carry something horrible around. People didn't like her asking those questions. She got some late-night calls and decided it wasn't worth her life. The last I heard, she had gone up north. We can't be 100% sure about the connection between Sarah Thompson and Isaac Freeman, but the timing of her questions and the specific kind of unusual cruelty she talked about make it likely that she was following a family oral history about the Wilson plantation practices. If so, her work is an important attempt to get back a history that others were trying to hide. A fire at the Montgomery County Courthouse in 1969 damaged many records from the 1,860 seconds, including most of the remaining records about the Wilson plantation. This was the same year that Thomas Marks died in a car accident. Official reports said that faulty electrical wiring caused the fire, but rumors continued to spread that it might have been set on purpose. Some people thought it was strange that it happened just as Marks was getting ready to publish his research, even though academics had turned it down. There were a number of troubling events that led Professor Jenkins to decide not to publish his findings about the Wilson plantation practices. Jenkins received anonymous letters telling him to leave sleeping dogs lie and remember that some old families still have influence. These letters were kept in Harvard University's archives, where he had private conversations with a colleague. More specifically, he learned that his research assistant, Thomas Marks, had been followed by an unidentified vehicle several times while he was interviewing people in rural areas outside of Montgomery. On the 3rd of March 1965, Jenkins wrote a letter to a colleague at Harvard that was very disturbing. In it, he said, "I fear T, and I may have stumbled upon something with tentacles extending into the present. Last week my office was broken into, though nothing of value was taken. The only items disturbed were my research files on the W plantation. The photograph itself, the one showing the jar, was removed from its folder and left conspicuously on my desk. This feels like a message, though from whom and to what specific end I cannot say with certainty." 3 months later, Jenkins suddenly stopped his research and sent his report to the university archives with a restriction limiting access to academic researchers with specific approval. He agreed to be a visiting professor at the University of Chicago for the next academic year, and he never wrote about plantation psychological control mechanisms again in his work. His published research moved on to less controversial parts of Southern cultural history. After his article was turned down, Thomas Marks became more and more obsessed with documenting the Wilson case. He is said to have used his own money to travel around the Southeast, interviewing older African Americans whose families had ties to the plantations in the Montgomery area. Marks's sister said in an interview in 1970, after his death, that he thought he was being watched and carried a gun and changed hotels often while he was doing research. Marks died in a car accident on a country road outside of Selma, Alabama, where he had gone to talk to a possible source. Police reports said that his car went off the road on a straight stretch of highway when the weather was fine. There were no other cars involved. The officer who looked into the accident said it was consistent with the driver falling asleep or becoming otherwise unable to drive, even though there were no medical records of this. The car did not have the research materials that Marks usually kept in a locked briefcase. In 1971, journalist Caroline Reed wrote about the Wilson plantation photograph in an article for The Atlantic about how historical research was being kept secret. This brought the story to the attention of the public for a short time. Reed's article, "The Histories We Cannot Tell," used Jenkins and Marks's failed research as an example of how powerful groups could easily control the stories that are told about the past. The Wilson-Caldwell family threatened to sue The Atlantic over the article, and the magazine published a partial retraction in a later issue, saying that certain unverified allegations regarding historical plantation practices should have been presented with more explicit qualification. Over the next few decades, the story of Isaac Freeman and the Wilson plantation practices became something of a scholarly urban legend. Many historians of the antebellum South knew about it, but it wasn't often talked about in formal academic settings. There were occasional mentions in specialized publications, but they were usually very vague and didn't name names or places. The archaeological discovery of the glass jar containing preserved fingers in 1960 should have provided physical evidence supporting the account derived from the photograph and documentary sources. But the fact that there isn't much documentation of this find and that the remains were reburied without a thorough analysis shows how things were done back then, when archaeological ethics about human remains weren't as strict as they are now. The archaeological team filed a short report saying that the jar was found during routine trenching for a soil survey. They noted what was inside but did not take pictures of it before putting it back in the ground. One of the archaeologists on that team, Daniel Peterson, went on to become a well-known archaeologist who studied plantation sites. Peterson talked about finding the jar in an interview for an oral history project in 1987 that looked at how historical archaeology has changed in the South. "We found things that never made it into official reports. The political climate wasn't right, especially when it involved well-known families who were still involved in local business and politics. I've often wondered if we should have done more to document that jar we found at the Wilson site. But at the time, the developer was pushing to finish the survey, and there was pressure not to delay the project over what could be seen as unpleasant curiosities. The Eastdale Mall, which opened in 1977, took the place of the Wilson Plantation as a commercial development. The mall's design and advertising don't say anything about the history of the land where it stands. Historians in the area say that this erasing of plantation histories is common in the South, where commercial developments rarely mention the economies that were based on slavery that used to be in the same places. In 1992, historian James Washington tried to find the Wilson Plantation photograph as part of his research for a big study on how psychological control was used against enslaved people. At first, the National Archives took a long time to respond to his requests. Washington got a response after asking many times that the photograph could not be found in their collections, even though catalog records show that it was moved there in 1972. Washington's later Freedom of Information Act request turned up an internal memo that said the photograph had been taken out of the collection in 1985 for conservation assessment, but had never been put back. The Conservation Department didn't have any record of getting the item. Washington wrote about his experiences in the 1994 article Disappearing Evidence, The Challenges of Researching Plantation Atrocities in the Journal of African American History. Marcus Reynolds, a digital humanities researcher, made a detailed reconstruction of the Wilson Plantation photograph in 2004 using written descriptions and similar modern images. This digital approximation tried to show what Margaret Hamilton and others had said they saw, even though it wasn't a replacement for the original evidence. Reynolds' reconstruction depicted a formal plantation scene, featuring a black man at the frame's edge, grasping what seemed to be a small glass jar filled with indistinct pale objects. Reynolds showed this reconstruction at a digital humanities conference, but after talking to ethics experts, he decided not to make it widely available online. He said in his conference paper, "Creating visual representations of historical trauma raises significant ethical questions, particularly when the subjects were denied agency and dignity in the original context." While this reconstruction aims to recover suppressed history, it risks reproducing the very objectification it seeks to critique. The Wilson Caldwell family's attempts to limit access to the photograph and related research materials are typical of how powerful and wealthy families have dealt with potentially damaging historical discoveries. There have been similar cases in the South, where descendants of plantation owners have used legal threats, political connections, and charitable ties to cultural institutions to keep people from getting materials that could damage their family's reputation. The Wilson case is especially important because it shows how psychological torture methods that left few physical marks were easier to forget about in history. The lack of clear physical violence helped Thomas Wilson keep his reputation for treating people well, which his descendants could use later to challenge researchers' findings. The fact that his psychological control system was so complicated and had a fake scientific look made it easier to write off stories as exaggerated or wrong. In 2012, something unexpected helped the case move forward. When workers were fixing up a historic home in Montgomery that used to belong to Frederick Sullivan, the photographer who took the 1861 picture, they found a hidden compartment in an upstairs wall that held a metal box. There was a journal and a number of glass plate negatives wrapped in cloth inside. The owner of the house called the Alabama Department of Archives and History, without knowing how important it might be. Archivists quickly figured out that the negatives were Sullivan's work, and they included a few pictures from the Wilson plantation session. Sullivan's journal had his private thoughts about his photography jobs, including some disturbing things he saw on the Wilson property. An entry from the 12th of April 1861 said, "Finished the Wilson Commission today. This is the most unusual request I've ever gotten. Mr. Wilson wanted a picture of the Negro Isaac holding the specimen jar. He said it was important to document his management methods for his future son-in-law. "I've found the practice disturbing, but I can't refuse the business. The Negro man's expression haunts me, complete emptiness in the eyes, as if he were looking at nothing at all. I won't include this image in the formal delivery, but I will keep the negative for my own records." This journal entry was a very important piece of evidence that the photo was real and had a purpose. It confirmed that the picture was taken on purpose to show how Wilson ran his business and that the photographer himself thought the practice was strange. It probably explained the most important thing: why the picture wasn't part of the official portrait series sent to the Wilson family. Instead, it stayed in Sullivan's private collection until he died. The discovery sparked new interest in the Wilson plantation case. Historians Dana Mitchell and Robert Carter got money for a full investigation, which included trying to find any living descendants of Isaac Freeman who might have family stories or documents about the case. Their search took them to Chicago, where they found 3 people who were related to Isaac Freeman through family trees. One of them, Elijah Freeman, had a family Bible with handwritten entries in it that went back to 1870. There was a pressed flower and a small envelope in the Bible. A handwritten note inside the envelope said, "From the tree where the burden was laid to rest. Never forget, never return." It was signed I.F. and dated the 12th of August, 1866. Elijah Freeman's family oral history says that his ancestor Isaac had been mentally imprisoned but was able to escape by burying something under a tree before leaving Alabama for good. The family story said that Isaac had to carry death in his hands as punishment for his brother trying to escape. Isaac buried his brother's body after he was freed and promised never to go back to Alabama. He went north and finally settled in Illinois, where he lived until he died in 1902. He is said to have refused to have his picture taken and to have hidden his hands whenever strangers were around. Botanists looked at the pressed flower from the family Bible and found that it was Quercus nigra, or water oak, a type of tree that grows all over Alabama. This botanical evidence, though circumstantial, established a concrete link to the narrative of Isaac interring his brother's remains beneath a tree prior to departing the state. Mitchell and Carter published their findings in a detailed book called The Burden: Psychological Control and Resistance on the Wilson Plantation in 2015. The book had copies of Sullivan's journal entries, pictures of the Freeman family Bible, and a lot of information about the psychological control methods that Thomas Wilson used. The Wilson-Caldwell descendants, who are not as well known in Montgomery society as they used to be, did not take legal action against the publication. The book made people talk about how stories of psychological torture during slavery have been left out of most history books. Mitchell said in an interview, "Our historical record has documented physical brutality against enslaved people, though not completely. However, the sophisticated psychological torture methods used by someone like Thomas Wilson leave fewer obvious traces and are easier to erase from collective memory. These are the histories that powerful interests have been most successful at suppressing, precisely because they challenge comforting narratives about the nature of oppression and resistance." Isaac Freeman's story, in which he was forced to carry his brother's preserved remains as a way to control his mind, gives us important information about the complicated ways that people resisted and survived slavery. That Isaac eventually buried the jar and left Alabama is an act of reclamation and resistance, even though it took him years of mental captivity to do it. The fact that his descendants kept the memory of this act alive, passing it down through generations even though it was traumatic, shows how important family oral histories are for keeping truths that official records often leave out. A small memorial plaque is in a quiet part of the Eastdale Mall parking lot today. It was put there in 2018 after community activists asked the mall management to do so. The plaque reads simply, "This land was once the Wilson plantation. We remember those who suffered here and honor their humanity, dignity, and resistance." The plaque makes no specific mention of Isaac Freeman or the psychological torture methods documented in the 1861 photograph, but its presence represents a small acknowledgement of histories long suppressed. The jar that Isaac Freeman was forced to hold in that photograph, containing his brother's preserved fingers, embodied the perverse logic of slavery's psychological dimensions. It transformed a family bond into an instrument of control, weaponizing love and connection to enforce submission. That Thomas Wilson considered this humane compared to physical punishment reveals the moral distortions that allowed the institution to persist. The jar became both the method of Isaac's captivity and eventually the focus of his act of reclamation when he finally buried it under the water oak tree. In his final years, according to family accounts shared with Mitchell and Carter, Isaac Freeman refused to speak about his time on the Wilson plantation. The only exception came on his deathbed when he reportedly told his son, "I carried him with me until I could lay him properly to rest. Then I carried the memory so no one would forget. Now you must carry it, but only as a memory, never as a chain." This instruction to carry the memory but not the chain encapsulates the complex relationship between remembrance and trauma that characterizes much of African American engagement with slavery's clom. Psychological legacy. To remember is necessary for dignity and truth, but to be defined solely by that memory risks perpetuating the psychological control mechanisms established during slavery. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Isaac Freeman's story is not what was done to him, but what he ultimately did in response. After years of being forced to carry his brother's remains as a mechanism of control, he transformed that same act into one of reclamation and proper burial. By choosing when and where to finally bury his brother, he took back control of a situation that was meant to keep him from having any power. The picture of Isaac holding the jar in 1861 was meant to show that he was being held captive. That the image was later suppressed shows how even visual evidence can be controlled by people who have the means and the desire to do so. But the story the picture told of how smart systems of control can be and how they can make people fight back couldn't be completely erased, even after decades of active suppression. As we think about the Wilson plantation case today, we are reminded that memory of the past is a battleground. Our understanding of the past and the present is shaped by what we remember, what we forget, and what we never learned in the first place. The story of Isaac Freeman, who was forced to hold his brother's body and then chose to bury it on his own terms, shows us that even in the most tightly controlled systems, people still want to be free and have dignity. In the words that Mitchell and Carter chose to close their book, the jar that Thomas Wilson created as an instrument of control became in Isaac Freeman's hands something else entirely, a burden carried until it could be transformed through the simple, profound act of burial. In this transformation lies a truth about human resistance that no system, however sophisticated, has ever fully conquered. The Wilson plantation photograph, which shows Isaac Freeman holding the jar with his brother's preserved fingers, is still officially missing, taken out of archives, hidden from the public, and not included in mainstream historical accounts. But the story it tells keeps coming out through bits of evidence, family oral histories, and the hard work of researchers who won't let history be forgotten. Some truths may be hidden for a while, like the jar itself, which is now buried under a water oak tree in Alabama soil, but they are never really gone. They remain, waiting to be recognized, acknowledged, and ultimately reckoned with by future generations seeking a more complete understanding of our shared past.